The Galactic court sat in its usual majestic silence, the echoes of distant worlds lost in the vast chamber. Alien species, diplomats, and judges of unimaginable power filled the seats, all waiting for the trial to begin. Today was different. The human defendant, Aiden Strathmore, stood alone before the most influential beings in the galaxy. His expression was unreadable, his posture calm and composed, but there was something else, something unsettling, about him. In the center of the room stood Princess Solara, a figure of unmatched grace. She was the emissary of her people, the leader of a mighty and ancient species whose power had been unchallenged for centuries. Her royal line was believed to be the epitome of purity and strength. But today, her gaze was not filled with triumph. Instead, it was sharp, cold, and filled with a question. Why did Aiden refuse to look at her? It wasn't the first time such a question had arisen. In the days leading up to the trial, whispers had spread throughout the galaxy. How could a mere human dare to behave in such a manner before royalty? How could he stand in the presence of one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy and refuse to meet her gaze? To most, the answer was simple. Aiden Strathmore was defiant, disrespectful, and ignorant of the customs of those around him. It was an affront, a challenge to the very foundations of the Galactic Order. But as the trial began and the courtroom's silence deepened, there was something more to it, something that none of them could understand. Aiden had been summoned to answer for a single accusation, disrespect toward the princess. It was a serious charge, one that could have grave consequences for a human in a galaxy filled with more powerful ancient races. Humans were considered insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But this human, Aiden, had done something none of his kind had ever dared. He refused to look at the princess. He refused to acknowledge her as the untouchable, divine figure that others did. He stood there, unmoved, staring only forward, his eyes locked on nothing in particular. The trial began with the usual formalities. The lead judge, a towering figure whose species had lived for millennia, raised his hand and called the court to order. "Aiden Strathmore," he boomed in a voice that echoed across the chamber, "you are accused of showing disrespect to Princess Solara, representative of the Solarian people, by refusing to acknowledge her presence. How do you plead?" Aiden's voice was calm as he spoke. "I plead not guilty." The court stirred at his words. It was customary to plead guilty or request a sentence, but not this human. He stood firm, defiant, yet his gaze remained unchanged. He did not look at the princess. He did not look at anyone. The room was heavy with the tension that only the unspoken could create. The princess's eyes narrowed. Her lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible frown. For the first time in her life, she felt something she had never experienced: discomfort. She had dealt with every manner of creature in the galaxy, from the most monstrous of aliens to the most esteemed of diplomats. Yet this human, with his silence and his refusal to even glance at her, was unlike anything she had ever encountered. "You are accused of refusing to acknowledge your superior, the Princess of Solara," the judge continued, his voice cold as if trying to force an answer out of Aiden. "Do you deny this?" "I do not deny it," Aiden replied. Solara shifted in her seat. This was not the response she had expected. She was used to seeing fear in the eyes of those who stood before her, even if they were powerful in their own right. But Aiden was different. There was no fear in his eyes. There was nothing but an unsettling calm. The prosecutor, a member of the Arcturan race known for their sharp legal minds, stood up next. His species was known for their strategic intellect, and he had been the one to present the case against Aiden. His words were as sharp as his claws. "Your Honor, members of the court, we have witnesses who saw Aiden Strathmore enter the royal palace with Princess Solara present. We have the testimony of dozens of witnesses who saw him refuse to even glance at her. Such behavior cannot be excused, for it is a blatant insult to the very structure that binds us together. To disrespect the princess is to disrespect the peace we have fought so long to maintain." There was a murmur in the court. The accusation hung in the air like a shadow. Everyone waited for Aiden's response. "I did not disrespect her," Aiden said, his voice steady. "I simply chose not to look." His words were simple, but they were heavy with meaning. It was not a confession of guilt, nor an explanation for his actions. It was a statement of defiance. Yet it seemed to confuse the very fabric of the court. The princess's eyes were fixed on him now. Her gaze, once cold and calculating, had shifted into something else. It was no longer about authority or power. It was about curiosity. What was it about this human that made him stand so resolute? Why, when he was in the presence of someone like her, did he remain unmoved? "What is it, human?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried across the room. "Why do you refuse to look at me?" Aiden remained silent for a long moment, his expression unchanged. Then, finally, he spoke. "I refuse to look because I do not see you as a princess," he said, his words deliberate. "I see you as a person, no different than anyone else in this room, and I refuse to treat you differently because of your title." The room fell into absolute silence. For a moment, no one knew how to react. Princess Solara, whose bloodline was the symbol of everything the galaxy held sacred, stood still, her expression unreadable. But there was a flicker in her eyes, an unspoken question, a challenge to the very foundations of her existence. Aiden's refusal to look at her was not simply an act of defiance. It was a rejection of the very concept of hierarchy and power that governed the galaxy. It was a challenge to everything the court stood for. The prosecutor, realizing the gravity of the situation, snapped back into action. "This is an act of insubordination," he yelled. "This human is mocking the princess and mocking the court itself. He should be punished." But the judge raised his hand to silence the room. "Enough." The courtroom went quiet once more. The judge turned to Aiden, his gaze hard and unyielding. "You refuse to look at her? You claim to see her as no different than anyone else. Do you understand the consequences of such a belief?" Aiden nodded, his gaze still focused on the empty space before him. The princess remained silent. Her thoughts were swirling. Never before had someone spoken to her like this. Never before had she been made to question the weight of her own title, the weight of her bloodline, the weight of everything she had known. And yet, there was something about Aiden's words that resonated with her, something about the way he stood there, unwavering, that made her wonder if she had been wrong about everything. The trial continued, but the real battle was not one of words. It was a battle of perception. Aiden had not only refused to look at the princess, he had refused to acknowledge the very structure of their galaxy's power. And as the trial moved forward, the question that lingered in the air was no longer about whether Aiden Strathmore was guilty of disrespecting Princess Solara. It was about whether the galaxy itself was ready to confront the truth that Aiden had so boldly revealed. The courtroom's atmosphere had shifted, and the tension was thicker than ever. The silence following Aiden's words hung in the air, a presence of its own, heavy with meaning. Everyone was waiting, watching, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The Princess Solara was still standing there, her eyes narrowing as she tried to understand the implications of Aiden's refusal to look at her. For the first time, she felt like she was on the edge of something dangerous, yet also freeing. Her entire existence had been built around the belief that her royal bloodline set her apart from every other being in the galaxy. She had always been taught that her title and lineage were what made her important. The galaxy had been shaped by the authority of her people for centuries, and yet here was a human who was telling her, in front of the highest leaders and officials of the galaxy, that none of that mattered. He refused to see her as superior because of her title. He saw her as nothing more than a person, no different than anyone else in the room. The thought was unsettling, But there was something else in Aiden's words that had struck a chord within her. It was a seed of doubt. Doubt about her role. Doubt about everything she had known. For a moment, she forgot the court around her. She felt herself questioning everything. The people who had raised her, the lessons she had been taught, and the life she had lived in the shadow of her ancestors. Was it possible that the truth she had always believed in was not the truth at all? The court's proceedings had temporarily paused as the weight of Aiden's defiance lingered in the room. The judge, Tarmok, the ancient leader who had presided over countless trials, finally spoke again, his voice a deep rumble that commanded attention. "Aiden Strathmore," he said, his tone measured, "you stand accused of disrespecting Princess Solara. But your words and actions suggest something far deeper. What you say goes beyond a simple act of defiance. It speaks to something that challenges the very foundation of our way of life." Aiden stood unmoved, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He didn't need to look at anyone, not even the judge. His silence was louder than words. He wasn't afraid of the consequences, nor was he interested in defending his actions. All that mattered was that he had spoken the truth, and that was all he could do. "The court has heard your plea," Judge Tarmok continued, "but there is more to this, a truth that goes beyond your refusal to acknowledge the princess." He paused, his sharp eyes studying Aiden carefully. "We have discovered something, a truth that you, Aiden Strathmore, seem to know, a truth that the galaxy has kept hidden for centuries." The words echoed through the court like a shockwave. Solara's heart skipped a beat, and for the first time, a hint of fear crossed her face. She had always believed that her people's past was untouchable, their history too powerful to be questioned. But now, for some reason, she felt like that history was slipping from her grasp. Aiden didn't flinch. "I know the truth," he said softly. "And it's time it was told." The room was filled with whispers. The members of the court looked at one another, unsure of what was happening. Some were curious, some were fearful, and others were confused. But all of them were on edge. Solara stepped forward, her usual composure beginning to crack. "What truth, human?" she demanded, her voice trembling slightly. "You speak of truths that could destroy everything we've built. What do you know that could change the course of our galaxy?" Aiden met her gaze for the first time. His eyes weren't filled with malice or anger. Instead, they were filled with something else, understanding. Understanding of something that Solara had never truly seen before. Aiden wasn't afraid of her. He wasn't intimidated by her title or her power. In his eyes, she was just another person. "I know the truth about your bloodline," Aiden said quietly. "I know about the pact your people made centuries ago, a pact that has been hidden from the galaxy." The words hung in the air heavier than any sentence. The court fell into absolute silence. Solara felt her legs weaken, and for a moment, she thought she might fall. The truth Aiden spoke of was not just any secret. It was a truth that, if revealed, could shake the very core of the galaxy's power structure. For a long time, Solara's people had been believed to be the purest race in the galaxy. Their bloodline, untouched by other species, had been seen as a symbol of divine power. But Aiden's words were threatening to unravel that very myth. He was speaking of a forbidden pact made long ago, a secret that could expose the Solarian royal family as no different than any other species, imperfect, flawed, and vulnerable. Solara felt a chill run down her spine. Her heart raced, and her thoughts were chaotic. She had always known that the history of her people was not without its dark moments. But to have someone so openly speak of it in front of the galaxy, this was something she had never anticipated. She had spent her entire life hiding from this truth, doing everything in her power to protect her people's legacy. But now, the truth was right there in front of her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it from coming out. "How dare you?" Solara finally said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. "You know nothing of my people." "Nothing of our history." Aiden shook his head. "I know enough." The truth cannot be hidden forever. The members of the court were silent, unsure of what to make of this revelation. Some had already heard rumors, whispers of the pact between the Solarians and a long-forgotten alien species, but nothing had ever been confirmed. Now, here it was, spoken out loud in the open, in front of the galaxy's most powerful leaders. The judge's voice boomed across the room. "Enough," he commanded. "We will investigate these claims further. But know this, Aiden Strathmore, the truth you speak of may change everything. It may alter the balance of power in ways you cannot imagine." But Aiden stood firm, his eyes never leaving Solara. "Let it change everything," he said quietly. "It's time for the truth to come out. It's time for the galaxy to see your people for what they really are." Solara felt a wave of panic rise within her. She had spent her life being groomed for this moment, for this role. Her people's power had been built on a foundation of lies, and Aiden had just cracked that foundation wide open. The truth was out there now, and there was no going back. The trial, which had started as a simple dispute, had now become something much larger. It was no longer just about Aiden's refusal to look at the princess. It was about something much deeper, something that could bring down the entire galactic order. The judge called for a recess, but no one moved. The silence in the court was deafening. The truth had been spoken, and now the galaxy had to decide how it would handle the revelation. Solara stood there, her mind racing. She had always known this day might come, but she had never imagined it would be like this. She had never imagined it would be a human, Aiden Strathmore, who would be the one to bring it all crashing down. The trial had taken a turn no one had anticipated. What began as a simple accusation of disrespect had now become a confrontation that threatened to shake the very foundations of the galaxy. Aiden Strathmore stood before the court, his resolve unshaken, his silence louder than any words spoken. The secret he had revealed about Princess Solara's bloodline had sent ripples of shock through the room. It was no longer just about a refusal to look at royalty. It was about an ancient truth, a truth that could destroy everything the galaxy had ever believed in. Solara had retreated into herself, standing tall, yet trembling on the inside. The words Aiden spoke had hit her like a hammer, and the weight of them pressed down on her chest. She had been born into the royal line, raised to believe that her family was untouchable, that their blood was sacred and pure. But now the truth was out. She was not what she had always believed herself to be. She was not the heir to an unbroken legacy of power and purity. Her family had made a pact, a forbidden alliance with an alien species long lost to history, a deal that had been buried for centuries, hidden away from the galaxy that revered her. Her hand shook as she clasped them together, the reality of it all sinking in. She was no different from any other ruler who had hidden the darkness of their past. She had spent her life building an image, crafting a persona that everyone around her could worship. But now, that image was cracking, and she wasn't sure if there was anything left beneath it. "Aiden Strathmore," the judge's voice cut through the silence. "You stand here not just to answer for your actions, but for a truth that could unravel the entire galaxy's order." "Do you realize what you've done?" Aiden's gaze remained fixed ahead, not at the judge, not at Solara, but somewhere beyond them, as though his mind was elsewhere. "I've done what needed to be done," he replied, his voice calm. "The truth is not something to be feared. It is something to be accepted." The judge's expression was unreadable, but the tension in the room was thick. The members of the court, once confident in their power and influence, were now uncertain. They had spent their lives respecting the Solarians as the supreme race, their royalty above reproach, but now their faith had been shaken. What was left when the foundation of everything they had believed in collapsed? "Your words carry weight," Judge Tarmac said slowly. "But do you understand the consequences of revealing this truth? The Solarians have long been seen as the guardians of peace, the ones who hold the galaxy together. If this pact is exposed, if the galaxy learns of this dark chapter in their history, It could lead to war. It could tear apart the delicate balance we have worked so hard to maintain. Aiden stood tall, his voice unwavering. If that's the cost of truth, then so be it. A galaxy built on lies is bound to fall eventually. The truth, no matter how painful, will set us free. It's time for all of us to face what we've been hiding. Solara's heart raced as she listened to Aiden's words. She had always been taught that her people's power came from their lineage, from the purity of their bloodline. To have that power questioned, to have it exposed as a lie, it was almost too much to bear. She had grown up believing that she was a symbol of everything good and pure in the galaxy, but now she saw herself as nothing more than a product of a past she could not escape. The courtroom was silent, the weight of Aiden's words hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. Solara could feel the eyes of the court upon her, some filled with pity, others with fear. The princess had always been the one in control, the one who held the galaxy in her hands. But now she was just another person, vulnerable and exposed. For the first time in her life, she felt small. She turned her gaze to Aiden, her voice barely a whisper. "Why do you do this? Why expose the truth? You have nothing to gain from this." Aiden's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, he looked at her not as a princess, but as a person. Because it's the right thing to do. You don't have to hide anymore. You don't have to carry the weight of your people's secrets. We're all human, Sailora. Even you. And humans make mistakes. The words stung, but Solara didn't flinch. Aiden wasn't trying to tear her down. He was trying to show her something she had never seen before. He was showing her her humanity, her flaws, her vulnerabilities. It was a kindness, even if she couldn't accept it. Solara took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. The truth was out, and there was no going back. She had been hiding behind a mask for too long, and now it had been ripped away. Her royal bloodline was not as pure as everyone had believed. She wasn't a god, a being above all others. She was just a person, like everyone else. And for the first time, she realized that it was okay to be human. The trial continued, but Solara's mind was elsewhere. She wasn't focused on the court anymore. She wasn't worried about the outcome. She was thinking about what Aiden had said. She was thinking about how much she had been hiding, not just from the galaxy, but from herself. For all her power, all her position, she had never truly known who she was, and now she was finally beginning to understand. As the court deliberated, Solara stood in the center of the room, her thoughts swirling. She was no longer just the princess of the Solarians. She was Solara, a person who had been shaped by her past, but who could still change her future. The revelation about her bloodline didn't have to be the end of her. It could be the beginning of something new. Aiden's words echoed in her mind. "We're all human, Solara. Even you." They were simple words, but they carried a weight that she had never fully understood. Perhaps for the first time, she was ready to embrace them. As the court reconvened, the judge spoke again. "The truth has been revealed, and the consequences will be felt throughout the galaxy. But we will not make a decision in haste. This matter is too important. We will need time to process everything that has come to light." The court agreed, and the session was adjourned. But as Solara walked out of the courtroom, she felt a sense of relief, something she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, she was no longer bound by the weight of her title, her people's expectations, or the lies that had shaped her life. She was free to choose her own path, and for the first time in a long time, she was ready to face the world not as a princess, but as a person. The Galactic Court was not the same after the trial. The walls that once held the unshakable structure of authority now seemed fragile, as though they too were vulnerable to the truth that had been laid bare. The atmosphere had shifted, and nothing would ever be the same again. Aiden Strathmore, the human who had refused to look at Princess Solara, had not only challenged her, but he had forced the entire galaxy to confront something it had long avoided. The secrets of the Solarian royal line, secrets that had been hidden for centuries, were now known to all. And there was no going back. The judges and the members of the court had retreated to their private chambers, discussing the aftermath of the trial. Some were outraged by Aiden's actions, while others were filled with fear at what the revelation meant. The fear was not just about the Solarians, but about the entire galaxy. What if other truths, even darker than this one, were waiting to be uncovered? What if the foundations of power that had been built over millennia were nothing but a house of cards? But outside the courtroom, in the corridors of the palace, something different was happening. Solara stood alone, her mind a storm of thoughts and emotions. She had been raised to believe in the divine purity of her bloodline, to trust in the idea that her family was above all others. But now that belief had been shattered. A human had dared to stand before her and show her the reality of her existence, and in that moment she realized something she had never understood before. She was not a symbol. She was not the ruler of a perfect people. She was simply a person, flawed and vulnerable, just like everyone else. For the first time in her life, Solara did not feel the weight of her title. She no longer saw herself as a divine figure, above all others. She saw herself as human, and with that realization, a strange sense of peace washed over her. She no longer had to carry the burden of perfection. She no longer had to hide behind the image of power that had been imposed upon her. She could finally be herself. But there was still one question that haunted her. Why had Aiden done this? Why had he exposed the truth, knowing the consequences it would bring? It wasn't just defiance. It wasn't just a refusal to acknowledge her power. Aiden had done something deeper. He had given her a chance to see herself for who she really was, not who she had been taught to be. He had forced her to confront the truth, no matter how painful. As Solara walked through the palace, her thoughts turned to Aiden. He had stood before the entire galaxy, not as a powerful ruler, but as a person. He had refused to be intimidated by her title. He had refused to bow to her authority. In doing so, he had stripped away the illusion that had surrounded her for so long. The court had adjourned, but the decision had not been made. The members of the court had agreed to meet again in a week's time to discuss the full implications of the trial. But Solara knew that the decision was no longer in their hands. It was in hers. She was no longer the untouchable princess. She was no longer the symbol of power and purity. She was Solara, a person who had made a choice to confront the truth and to embrace her humanity. As the days passed, Solara found herself spending more time alone, thinking about the revelations that had come to light. She spent hours in the palace's gardens, walking among the flowers that bloomed in the quiet stillness. The beauty of the gardens was the same as it had always been, but to her it now seemed different. The colors seemed brighter, the air fresher. It was as if the world had been waiting for her to see it for what it truly was. She could no longer deny the truth. She could no longer hide from it. The Solarians had made a pact with an alien species long ago, and that pact had shaped their destiny. But the truth was not something to be feared. It was something to be accepted. Just as Aiden had said, the galaxy did not need to crumble under the weight of secrets. It needed to be rebuilt on a foundation of honesty and transparency. But the decision was not hers alone to make. The fate of the galaxy and of the Solarian people was in the hands of the court. It was in the hands of those who had built their power on lies. Solara knew that the road ahead would not be easy. The galaxy would not simply accept the truth. There would be resistance, there would be anger, and there would be fear. But that was the price of honesty, and she was willing to pay it. The day of the court's reconvening arrived, and Solara took her seat once again. The room was filled with representatives from every corner of the galaxy, each one waiting for the final decision. The judge, Tarmak, took his place at the head of the court and called the session to order. "We stand here today Tarmac began, his voice booming across the room, not just to make a decision about Aiden Strathmore's actions, but to make a decision about the future of the galaxy. We have heard the truth. The Solarian royal bloodline is not as pure as we have been led to believe. The pact that has been hidden for centuries is now known. And we must decide what to do with this knowledge. Solara could feel the weight of the room's gaze upon her. The eyes of the galaxy were watching, waiting for her response. She had been the symbol of authority, the one who held the power. But now she was just one voice among many. She knew that whatever decision was made, it would change everything. The trial was no longer about Aiden. It was about the future of the galaxy and about the future of her people. Would they continue to hide behind lies, or would they choose to confront the truth and rebuild? "I stand here," Solara said, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "not as a princess, but as a person. I have hidden from the truth for too long, and I can no longer do that. The pact that my people made was not one of honor, but one of necessity. We were desperate, and we made a choice that we now regret. But we cannot continue to live in the shadow of that decision. It is time for us to face the truth, no matter what it costs." The room fell silent as Solara's words hung in the air. There were no protests, no objections. The galaxy had heard the truth, and they had heard it from the princess herself. The decision had been made. It was time to move forward. Judge Tarmac nodded, his expression solemn. "Then let it be known that we, the court, stand with you, Solara. We stand with the truth, and we will help you rebuild, not just your people, but the galaxy itself." In that moment, Solara knew that the future was uncertain. There would be challenges, there would be battles, and there would be those who would resist. But for the first time, she felt a sense of hope. The truth had been spoken, and with it, the galaxy had been given a chance to change. And as she left the courtroom, no longer as a princess, but as a person, she realized that the silence that had once defined her life had now become the silence of a new beginning.